everyone, Bella Power here with Estes Education. We are here with astronaut Bob Behnken talking about safety for our May Safety Week. And Bob, if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, Bella. I'm Bob Behnken. I'm a former NASA astronaut. I flew 2 space shuttle missions, as well as I was the test pilot for the first SpaceX Dragon capsule that went to the International Space Station. And I'm currently a vice president at Lockheed Martin Space.
Again, we are here talking about Safety Week, giving educators, students, everybody a lot of helpful information about safety and model rocketry. So to start, Bob, have you had any experience launching Estes rockets?
Well, thank you, Bella. I actually have had some experience both launching on rockets, but also launching some Estes rockets myself. And so one of the most memorable experiences, for me at least, was the time when I was preparing for my launch out of the Kennedy Space Center and spending the day at the beach house there in Florida, where we were in quarantine. So we had our own special place that we needed to stay so that we could launch safely and healthfully to the International Space Station. And we brought Estes rockets to the beach house with us there in Florida, set them up and launched and recovered them prior to our launch on board that SpaceX mission to the International Space Station. So we kind of worked our way up with a nice build-up approach, starting with a small motor, working our way up to sea. And once we had successfully recovered the rocket after the sea engine launch, we put it in a special place in that beach house for future crews to see when they go to launch out of the Kennedy Space Center. It was a wonderful experience, be able to spend with my young son and kind of walk him through what my launch was going to look like with a model rocket, though.
Very cool. I love that. I love involving kids in rocketry because not everybody gets to go up on a real rocket ship, but anybody could launch a rocket and see all the mechanics. So really amazing that you get to do that with your family.
I was super happy to get the experience and happy that the weather cooperated. So the winds were perfect, not necessarily blowing everything out to sea or everything back on shore, but in a way that we could safely recover the rockets.
Nice. And to confirm, you didn't have any rockets land in the ocean?
We came close to losing a rocket into the ocean, but only to about 3 foot deep or so. And so we did have the recovery team head out into the water. And my wife actually made an incredible save catching the rocket before we lost it in the ocean.
So at Estes Education and Estes Rockets, we always instruct everybody to follow the NAR Safety Code when they're launching rockets. Do you have any advice for students and teachers as far as following the NAR Safety Code and some of the safety precautions that you take?
Thank you, Bella. I do think it's really critical that you follow the safety instructions, the NAR Safety Code, whenever you execute a launch. We go through some very careful scripted procedures to ensure that we think of everything before we launch humans. And you should go through a similar sort of a checklist in terms of your preparation. So whether that's making sure that you've built a rocket out of the materials that came in your kit, whether it's that you've set up a launch range, a launch facility that's a safe place to execute from, depending on the size of the motor, that, for example, the wind conditions and the dryness of the local area, for example, to make sure that you've got an appropriate launch site before you go down the pathway of actually launching. And then when the time comes to launch, keeping people a safe distance away, as well as being prepared for the situation where your rocket doesn't launch. And so if it doesn't go, you need to take the appropriate safety precautions, pausing for the right amount of time before anyone approaches to make sure that the rocket's safe. And then finally, I think from a recovery perspective, right, you need to be very careful to make sure that that's done in a safe way as well. And so allowing the rocket to kind of reach the ground or ensure that it's approaching safely at a slow speed, rather than racing to get underneath it and then having something untoward happen, like a parachute not open. So kind of working through those, making sure you use the right materials, have a good launch site, stay safe during the launch and the recovery is all critical for a successful and happy day in your rocket launch experience.
I agree that those are really great safety points. And here in Colorado with our Cosmic Club, we get to launch rockets with a lot of kids, and I have a rule that the range is closed until the rocket safely reaches the ground. And then I'll tell the kids the range is open, and then they can go recover the rocket. Because you're right, we do have a lot of kids that just want to race after it. And a lot of the times we have our parachute deploys, and we have a nice soft landing. But sometimes if they maybe didn't pack the parachute correctly, it's coming down a little harder than we want, maybe it didn't fully deploy, and you definitely want to have it touch down on the ground safely before you try to go after it. So.
Absolutely. And having a person who's designated as the safety spotter to remind everyone who's a part of the launch sequence that these rules are in place for a reason, and we all get excited during a launch. Even those of us who've ridden on a rocket still sometimes get overwhelmed by the excitement of seeing a rocket launch up into the air or even further into space. But having one person whose job it is to make sure that the rules are being followed, I think, is also a critical step to safe operations.
Really great advice. So, of course, you had the opportunity to fly on the space shuttle, which is super exciting. And then also, when the USA first started launching astronauts again from American soil, before we had Russia helping us out, and the first time that we were launching again on American soil with the NASA SpaceX Demo 2 mission. So 2 really different missions. Can you talk on any of the safety protocols and things that you had to follow to prepare for those missions, and maybe during the missions and landing and things like that?
In general, every rocket launch, the safety needs to be managed very carefully. That was true for the space shuttle, and it was true for the Dragon launch. The space shuttle, being both a rocket and an airplane when it came back to land, had some different weather constraints, and so we needed really good landing conditions both for an airplane and really good launch conditions for a rocket whenever we executed those missions. And so there was a large team that checked the weather forecast both in Florida, where we were launching from and could potentially land from, as well as across the world, because there were other landing sites that we might take advantage of. The SpaceX vehicle was a little bit different from a safety perspective and what needed to be managed. And you'll see this, I think, in the Estes rockets that you build, depending on the size of the motor, whether it's 2-stage, just how complex that operation is, that you might need slightly different range considerations in terms of being able to launch from safely and execute the mission. That SpaceX rocket, we had to consider the weather conditions across the Atlantic Ocean, because our situations, if we had a failure, would put us into the Atlantic Ocean rather than one of those runways that the space shuttle needed. And so just different needs for different rockets, and I think that applies to the Estes model rockets as well.
I agree. And yeah, we always when we're launching model rockets, we're paying attention to the weather conditions. We don't launch in winds that are higher than 20 miles per hour. Of course, you can't launch if it is raining. You want to make sure that you're not launching into clouds and your sky is clear. Even if things like airplanes and birds, you want to make sure you have absolutely clear skies before you launch. So it sounds like, a little bit differences in the complexity of the safety rules for a launch and recovery, but still really important that you're following safety rules.
Absolutely. And you mentioned whether it's wildlife or otherwise, we did have to watch for wildlife off the Florida coast. We launched right adjacent to a wildlife bird sanctuary. And so both for the safety of the birds as well as for the safety of the rockets, frankly, we needed to make sure that we were operating safely just based on what all was on the range when it came time for us to go.
So when we had spoken previously, you had kind of touched on a situation where maybe some people were not following the safety rules and how that affected your mission. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Well, in general, if we have an airplane that ends up in the range, for example, we would scrub a shuttle launch. We would delay the launch of a mission because somebody wasn't potentially kind of following the rules. And I think that's applied to our Estes rocket launches as well. My son and I, in practice, the dry runs on our way to launching down in Florida prior to my launch, used the local park where we lived. And so we would always be careful to make sure that the people who were in the park knew that we were getting ready to launch and were clear of our range before we went off and executed. And so again, having somebody to kind of run the gauntlet and make sure we're following the safety rules, and that might include telling people, we have to do that for big rocket launches like the Artemis mission that's on the screen behind me, the space shuttle mission that I was a part of. We send out notices so that people know that we're getting ready to launch, and I'm sure if you're launching at a school, something similar, folks in the area need to know what's going on.
Absolutely. And I think I read also in the news when you were landing, like some people may have they're really excited because it's a super exciting event, especially getting to see it in person, and maybe coming too close to like your landing site. And again, that's something in rocketry where if we're at a park, you need to make sure that you're telling people around the location, like, hey, we're, launching rockets. In the event that our rocket doesn't land where it's supposed to, like, we want you out of harm's way. And that not only, protects you, but also protects like people who are just, really excited about what's going on.
Thank you, Bella. Yes, that specific example for the Dragon capsule when we returned, it was a little bit different than the traditional shuttle landing. When a shuttle lands, it landed typically on a government installation. There weren't people in the local area who could run out on the runway and get close to it and maybe put themselves in harm's way unknowingly. When we landed with our SpaceX capsule, we landed in the Gulf of Mexico, and folks were really excited. They all didn't know that the rocket fuel, the things that the fuel that was a part of the small engines that helped us safely come back through the atmosphere is actually toxic to humans. And so it kind of goes back to what you were describing from a recovery operations perspective. When the range is open and when the range is closed, or when the range is clear and people can approach the vehicle that just landed, whether it's a small rocket that's come down via parachute or a SpaceX capsule in the middle of the Gulf, you need to do that with the approval of the appropriate authorities that it's safe to approach. And folks just didn't know for our capsule when we returned from that SpaceX mission, and I wish they had, because it can be a dangerous situation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Bella. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you a little bit today about the safety with respect to my missions with NASA, as well as in your own Estes rocket launch campaigns. And so I just encourage folks to take the opportunity. It can be done safely if you follow the guidelines that are laid out very safely, in my opinion. And I just hope that folks can have the same joy that I've had from all the model rocket execution that I've done in their upcoming launch campaign this spring.
Thank you. And what would you say to like a principal or an admin who maybe thinks that like they don't know a lot about model rocketry and they think it's just too dangerous? They think that there's too many risks to do it at school. What do you think your response to that would be?
In general, I think that the safety concerns are well founded, because you can execute rocket operations in an unsafe way, right? If you point them at people, if you don't point them up in the air, if you don't clear the range before you execute. So you do need a process that's in place that ensures safety is a consideration and it's managed throughout the execution. But if you accomplish that, I'll tell you that the kids that participate in these rocket launch campaigns, these opportunities, end up with a lifelong experience that they've learned things about science, things about engineering, even things about mathematics, even things about storytelling, to be able to tell the story of what excited them about the rocket launch campaign. And so while there are some safety mitigations that need to be put in place, it is you're setting kids up for kind of a lifelong memory, a story that they'll tell, an experience that they'll want to share as they go forward. And so it's worth the extra effort of managing the safety in order to provide that for kids, I think.
And lastly, do you have a message that you would tell to students, or anything that you would say about the importance of following the safety rules, whether they're wanting to launch a rocket like an Estes rocket, or wanting to be a part of a space mission and maybe launch up in their own rocket to space one day?
Well, I would add, Bella, just that following the safety rules that are out there sets you up to successfully execute the next launch campaign. And I think that's all on all of our minds as we're executing as astronauts, whether it's doing a spacewalk, whether it's launching on a rocket, is how do we set ourselves up to be able to have that next cool experience. And a huge portion of that is following the safety rules, learning from them so that you have that next opportunity to do it again.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again
Thank you,
so
Bella.
much for taking the time to meet with us today for Estes Education Safety Week. I hope that you have found this inspiring and helpful as you are continuing in your rocketry journey or maybe just starting. Thank you again so much for joining us, and happy launching.
Thank you, Bella. Let's go for launch safely.